Welcome to Sabby Sabs podcast. I'm your host, sabrinasalvati. My special guest tonight is Andre Stackhouse. You've probably seen Andre on here before, one of the biggest healthcare advocates that I know. But Andre actually is a part of a new project called Medicare for All Everywhere. Andre, welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me again, Sabrina. Good to be here.
All right, Andre, really quick, before we get started, can you explain to everyone a little bit about your healthcare activism and some of the projects you've been a part of?
Yeah, for sure. It all takes off really quickly because I think like a lot of people really got into this, with the original Bernie Sanders campaign. So I was kind of like an internet activist before that, where I was tweeting and getting into arguments on Facebook. But Bernie was really where I was like, I should step in and actually work on this stuff for real. And, since then, I was a Bernie delegate at the state and national convention in 2020. We voted no on the platform as a block because of its lack of Medicare for all. And it really, became my issue over the course of those two campaigns. And so, I started working on it back at home, and found Whole Washington. And at this time, I'm the campaign director of Whole Washington, where we're trying to get single payer on the ballot. But I think it's been just a little bit over a year that we founded Medicare for All Everywhere. And I suppose the other thing in there is led a couple of the healthcare justice marches in the last 2 years. So all about healthcare, really any way I can show up for it.
Awesome. Well said. So Andre is working on this project called Medicare for All Everywhere. And Andre, let me know when you're ready to share your screen. But to start with, can you explain to everyone, what is this about? What is the strategy for Medicare for All Everywhere?
Yeah, I'll just, I think I'll start sharing my screen, but the basic idea of this is that in my time working a bunch of different organizations, different levels of this fight, whether it's like more policy level or advocacy level, I noticed that there was so many different groups doing fantastic work, and yet they seem to be completely siloed, right? And so that kind of laid down the foundation for why I wanted to start Medicare for All Everywhere, was to create some connective tissue between all of these different parts of the movement. So this is just a little bit about me. I already mostly introduced myself, but from Bernie to campaign director of Whole Washington and co-founder of a national organization, I don't really know how it happened. Before all of this, I was a software engineer at Microsoft, but I've found a greater calling, I'd say. And I think you've had Terrence on your show before. He's in Massachusetts. He ran for office as an independent, had a really great campaign, but he's one of the co-founders of Medicare for All Everywhere, kind of just connected on Twitter. And he was asking about a sort of regional Northeast healthcare coalition. I said, well, let me do you one better. What about the entire country? And so we started to have these Medicare for All Everywhere meetings. Betty is somebody who I'd worked with in the past and has been all up and down the single payer movement in California. And so just, from day one, we had representation coast to coast, big states and smaller states. And so, we kind of just wanted to take a big picture look at the Medicare for All movement, right? And do some power mapping of where it is. And so, at the executive level, we had a president saying that he was ready to veto it. So many issues in the Senate, right? Even Bernie Sanders, right, kind of dragging his feet on introducing it, eventually did it on May 12th last year. So we've been happy about that. But, Manchin and Sinema showing how capable they are of killing incredibly popular legislation. And, Sinema's news today switching to an independent. So we don't even have technically necessarily that vote as part of the party block anymore. Then the parliamentarian, the filibuster. So incredible obstacles in the Senate. And then even in the House, right? We have a Congressional Progressive Caucus and a lot of people who support it, supposedly, right? But are waiting for permission from Nancy Pelosi. And now we see a new Speaker of the House who if anything, at least in line, who could be even more conservative on this issue, right? And so we wanted to think, how are we going to break through these incredible barriers? And Democratic Socialists of America actually had a really good Medicare for All organizing guide, and I think kind of articulates the idea better than anywhere else that I'd seen. So they said the realization of Medicare for All will not happen in a vacuum or handed down from the top, but one through a bottom-up mass movement. And in order for that to happen, the grassroots efforts at local, state, and regional level need to be built and interwoven. And so
Can
that,
I just interject really quick here?
yes, please, yes, please.
This piece is so important because I'm so glad that you mentioned Joe Biden saying that he would veto it, because we always come back to that point, right? Like, even if this were to pass, like in the House and then the Senate, we have a president that doesn't want it to happen. Ro Khanna mentioned this when he was on my show. He said, I'm sorry, but as long as you have a president that doesn't want it, it's not going to happen. And this is the reality, right? Like, so the fact that they have this, and this Democratic Socialists, that they do have this piece here, I think it's important for people to understand. Even with DSA, they were telling you from the very get-go that it is going to be a bottom-up mass movement. And sometimes I sit back and I think about it and I'm like, well, maybe we were going about this the wrong way. I don't know. Like, maybe we were going about this the wrong way, but they actually had this strategy laid out from, you know, the get-go. So they're trying to explain to people, sometimes we might have to make some changes, and they're telling you, you're going to need the grassroots effort on the local and the state level. And I think that's important for people to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, when we talk about that federal fight, right, I think that when you have a president, for instance, who's a Republican or who says they're going to veto it, what that signals to a lot of people is, well, it's hopeless. So because they're entirely focused on two bills, right? One bill in the House, one bill in the Senate, and the president. But when you think bigger, right, and you realize that the movement is a lot bigger than Congress, it's a lot bigger than the president, it's a lot bigger than two bills. It's actually a movement that has been going on since like the 40s, right? It's all across the country, even in states that you would never imagine, right? And so there's always these seeds, and the question is, can we cultivate them until they grow into a strong enough movement that is able to win this federally, once and for all?
Mhm.
But you can't just look at the destination, right? You have to look at the entire picture.
Right. That's right.
Um, so, and that, I think when we think about the context of this, right? So on the left, I've got Canada, and the province there is Saskatchewan, because that was the first province to pass Medicare in Canada, and really was the start of their healthcare revolution. And the point I always make about this is that Saskatchewan is not it's not an urban province. It is not a liberal province. It's like a rural conservative province, and yet, a socialist movement took control of that province, gave those people health care, and it was so popular that eventually it covered the entire country. And then in the United States, we have a kind of similar story, but like with a more mixed legacy, which is the state there is Massachusetts, because the last federal reform was Obamacare, or as it was
Yep.
previously known, Romney Care, but it came from Massachusetts. And the
That's
point is
me.
that, right, the states have incredible influence over federal policy, right? Um, and so we just observe that, and we start to think, okay, so if we're looking at the power that we have within the states, what could we do, right? And so, just as a sort of case study example, the national popular vote, right? The idea that we might want one. So this isn't about whether or not that's a good idea, but I was always told growing up that the electoral college was in the Constitution, and therefore it was the law of the land. And if you ever wanted to change it, you'd have to change the Constitution. But the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact was some very smart people who said, well, maybe I'll read the Constitution, see what it says. And what they found was that it actually says that the states can allocate their electors however they like. And so they had the idea, well, if enough of us agree that it ought to go to the winner of the popular vote, we could just choose to give our electoral votes to the winner of the popular vote. And so they created this compact where they say, join the compact, and if enough of us join it, we'll give our electoral votes to the winner of the popular vote. So you can see that little chart. It has the green for all the states that have joined the compact, and you see Massachusetts and Washington in there. But if you look at the yellow states with pending legislation, we actually almost have enough for 270 votes, which is to say that this is by far the most serious challenge to one of the deepest, most powerful institutions in US politics. And yet we could see this challenged in our lifetime, right? So it's not that California can eliminate the Electoral College, right? It's not that any state can eliminate the Electoral College, but the states together have incredible power to do things that might otherwise be insurmountably challenging.
Yeah, one thing I want to point out too with your map here, this is something that CJ has touched on multiple times about sometimes, a lot of times in the United States, these progressive policies per se, it starts on the coast first. It'll start on the West Coast. You guys are usually ahead of us, like over there in Seattle. Like it'll start on the West Coast, then it'll start like on the East Coast, more so the Northeast, and then it makes its way towards Middle America. So that's how a lot of these things started, whether it was with marijuana legalization. CJ points out the no smoking law where you can't smoke in restaurants. That started on the coast first. So a lot of times this is how these things start.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, women's right to vote is a good one, passed in just a couple of states first. And so that's kind of what we saw, right? It's like we actually have this movement, right? And there's all of these different groups running these campaigns in different states, and a lot of them have single payer policies. A lot of them, are working on legislation or an initiative, right? And so you see this spread across all of these different states. And so that's where that idea of, well, what if we join them into an actual coalition, right? And coalitions are very difficult to build. They, the details matter incredibly. So to kind of create the big picture vision, because right now this is more of an idea, right? The coalition doesn't exist yet, but the idea is more or less that you can imagine a partner for each state, right? Or a chapter for each state. And the point is that every partner in this supports both state and federal Medicare for all. And that is to help us create that bottom up, top down mass movement that doesn't factionalize, right? And instead remains a unified movement that moves forward together and then makes its decisions democratically. And so, that gives us all sorts of possibilities, right? So this one I call modular Medicare for all, right? And so what's the idea? Well, the first state might be really difficult to pass single payer in, right? We're trying to be the first one in Washington. Actually, Oregon just passed Measure 111 on the ballot, which
Yep.
we'll see if that makes it all the way through to a single payer implementation, right? But once that first state passes it, what about the states next to it, right? Can they link those plans together to create an interstate regional healthcare plan? And you can imagine, say, Washington, Oregon, California, like you say, being the first three states or being three states that pass it, join those states together into a really big healthcare plan. Now you're starting to achieve the kind of like economy of scale that really could be expanded to cover the whole country, right? So it might be difficult when you're starting small, but the bigger we can sort of make this, the more close we'll get to having it federally. Other ideas, right? So like cross-state fundraising, right? So some states are rich, some states are poor, some states have a ton of people, some states are spread out and low population, right? And most importantly, some states have really well-developed single-payer movements, and other states are maybe just getting started, maybe don't have a single-payer movement at all. So what if we raise money together, right? Imagine Washington, Maine, and Arkansas doing a cross-state fundraiser together, right? They raise those funds together, and then at the end of the day, they split them three ways between those three groups, right? Well, the state that's richer, that has more Medicare for all donors, right? They can help then by having those funds split, develop a state where $1,000 might go way farther, right? Because you're earlier in your campaign. So it might be what seems like a small amount of money to CalCare could be a huge amount of money to a state that's just getting started. And then cross-state infrastructure, and that could be anything from like phone banking, social media, digital tools like text banking, email lists, right? Because legislative sessions, they come and go, campaigns end, right? But the movement needs to never stop. And when, for instance, CalCare didn't make it over the finish line last year, right? Instead of all of those people who are working so hard on CalCare suddenly feeling like, well, what do I do now, right? I guess I'll go find some other thing to work on. Instead, we'd rather immediately plug them into, well, CalCare maybe is going to enter a little bit of a slow period, but whole Washington needs you now, right? And even though you're in California, that doesn't mean you can't pick up a phone. It doesn't mean you can't boost a message. It doesn't mean you can't even fly to a state and gather signatures. And in fact, that's one thing that we've done. So we organized trips in the last year, both to Maine and Washington, and had people from a couple of different states come and gather signatures for campaigns that were for healthcare plans that wouldn't even necessarily cover them when they went back home, but because they believe in this idea and want to help develop it further. And then getting into the ways that the states are special and why it actually makes us stronger to focus on all of the different states, right? So really common thing that people say, well, the states can't deficit spend, right?
Right.
But again, if you look into these things that are often presented as just hard truths, simple truths, often are a little bit more complicated. So the reason states can't deficit spend is because most of them have passed what's called a balanced budget requirement. It's just a rule, right? There's not like a law of physics. If they got rid of it, then it wouldn't be a rule. And it turns out that some states have very weak balanced budget requirements. And in fact, 2 states, Wyoming and North Dakota, have none, right? So you might not think of North Dakota as like a strong contender for a single payer healthcare state or like the first single payer healthcare state, but it might be that the fact that they don't have a balanced budget requirement actually makes it easier to finance, right? So we need to observe what we have in terms of our own power in each states and say, how can we
Right.
capitalize on that? So
Right.
same thing with ballot initiatives. Oh, go
I
ahead.
want to add something really quick about North Dakota that some people may not be aware of. North Dakota also has public banks.
Mm-hmm.
And some of you may wonder, well, why is that important? When people say, where are you guys going to get the money from? Where's the state going to get the money from? You get around that by having a public bank. So if North Dakota already has public banks, they should already be trying to do. I don't know anybody that lives in North Dakota, but if you guys know people that live there, they should already try to get some initiative going to get something like this done.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll come back to some of that in a minute. But yeah, ballot initiatives are similar, where some states have them, some states don't. Some states have very strong ballot initiatives, some have kind of weaker ones, right? But in some states, this is an incredibly powerful path to pursue, and you know that I'm all about it here in Washington. And others, it might not be possible. And in fact, you know, again, when we talk about that idea of like unified movement, fighting on all fronts. Right? You don't even have to choose. So here in Washington, we are trying to get this on the ballot, but we're also preparing to introduce this into the legislature, right? Into the House and the Senate, so that we can let our legislators hear from us and let them, you know that they're going to keep hearing from us until they co-sponsor our legislation, right? So that builds unified across legislative and initiative paths. And then a little extra note about initiatives, right? So these 7 states now are all states that have done Medicaid expansion, but there's 7 states that did it on the ballot. And the latest one is actually South Dakota, who just passed it in November on the ballot. And I think what is so remarkable about these states, right, is that their legislature didn't want to expand Medicaid. Their governor didn't want to expand Medicaid, but their people still needed health care. And their people organized themselves to put it on the ballot and then voted it into law. And, you know, there's a lot of different actions that people can take to expand single payer, right? Like we just passed a resolution at the Seattle City Council last week. But Medicaid expansion is, I think, one of the best ways because, you know, it's not just building support, it's getting people actual health care, right? So like, for instance, Patty Murray doesn't support Medicare for all. And it would be a great victory to get her to co-sponsor it, right? If we could like convince her, flip her vote on that. But at the end of the day, that'd be one more vote in the Senate and 0 more people with health care. But 45,000 people in South Dakota are now eligible because of this Medicaid expansion, right? So it gets us closer to national single payer, but it also gets people health care in the process. And I just like to add that, I myself am on Medicaid, and I'm in Washington, which is a Medicaid expansion state, but it's only because I'm on Medicaid that I'm able to be a full-time healthcare activist, right? So when you think about these small expansions make us freer and more powerful as like a people's movement because we have healthcare, and that helps us expand it further. And then to just sort of bring it all together, uh, the two big questions are always, how's it going to pass and how are you going to pay for it, right? And so I try to think of this into a bigger theory of change that kind of I find myself at the intersection of, right? So progressive taxation, is an answer to how are you going to pay for it. It's one of the challenges that we work with in Washington with a very regressive tax code. I think y'all do a lot better with that. But then we can go even beyond that with public banking, like you mentioned, right? Because then you can raise money through loans and through investment. And instead of paying interest off to some New York bank, you keep it in the state so that it can further fund infrastructure. And then last, small d democracy. And we talked about ballot initiatives, but there are so many different ways that we can expand small d democracy, whether it's automatic voter registration or vote by mail. And then that picture on the left, the unicameral, that's the legislature of Nebraska, because in Nebraska, and they did this through a ballot initiative, they actually don't have a separate House and Senate. They just have one legislature. And what that means is it's one fewer veto point, and the representation is more proportional, because in almost all cases, the Senate is a disproportional representation of the population. But in a unicameral legislature, they've done it in a proportional way, right? So if we have more political power as grassroots people and grassroots organizers, and if we have more economic power in our own homes, in our own states, then we can pass Medicare for all everywhere. So that's the big idea. We're on Slack. We got a website, medicareforalleverywhere.org. And it is early days, it's an exciting project to be a part of, but we're just trying our best to get in touch with all of these different groups, ask them if there are things we can collaborate on, and then over time, build that into a real formal coalition that eventually will include all 50 states and DC and the territories. That's what we're going for. And we think that if we can build that coalition, then we can 100% win national improved Medicare for all.
Well said, Andre. And I think it's really, I'm glad you brought up the point about public banks as well, because one of the issues that does come up is, or one of the cons that comes up where people say about state to state single payer, is that the federal government could come in and could deny it because the state still needs the funding. But one of the ways that you get around that is by having a public bank. And that's why I say North Dakota should definitely be jumping on this, because they can avoid that. They can avoid that. And that's one of the things too that I really want to like push. Shout out to Roger Meadows for the super chat. He mentioned this as well. Andre, let's find someone in North Dakota to push Medicare for all as a ballot initiative. I would really like to get public banking on the ballot for Massachusetts. It would be really great if we had a public bank here in the state. That would help us with a lot of these things, some of these other policies that we are trying to get passed. But I think I just want to point out, like, to people, totally we realize like this should be for everybody. Medicare for all should be for everybody. Single payer should be for everybody. We totally get that. I think what Andre is trying to point out to you, though, is that while we're sitting here waiting and hoping that one day we'll get a president who will let this go through. And right now, that's not happening anytime soon. And if Republicans take over the White House in 2024, it's definitely not going to happen. So what could you be doing in the meantime? And I think that's the point that Andre is trying to drive home to you guys. I want to show you their website here as well. Medicare for all everywhere. And Eric, could you put the link to the website in the chat as well. They also give information here, how you can volunteer. For those of you who do want to help, this is something that you can join, that you can be a part of. Again, like I said, like, we can sit around and we can be angry and we can be frustrated. And there's been a lot of frustration going around like the past couple of months. Oh dear. Or you can do something. You can try to do something. And I think that's the point. Like, um, Andre's driving home here. Now, I see there's a option here for a march. Is there a march planned at some point, or is this
Well,
something you're trying to do?
we did it on July 30th last year, which is the anniversary of Medicare. So it was 57 years, and we haven't like officially announced it, but what I can say is I personally have led two marches in the last 2 years in Seattle, and would be very surprised if we didn't do one this year. And for us, it's like the way that we try to organize is we try to step forward and say, we're doing this. Who wants to join us, right? So we're marching in Seattle. Who out there wants to march on the same day, right? And then, a lot of what we're doing again is sort of like we're not trying to invent the wheel or reinvent the wheel or like duplicate work that other people are doing. So we really like being sort of that clearinghouse where we have formed all the relationships. We know what the different movements in all the different states are. So you come to us, and then we help you get plugged in because you're maybe brand new to the movement. You've never heard of all of the orgs and stuff. It's difficult to navigate. So yeah, just get in touch with us. You can DM us on Twitter, or you can email us massmovement at gmail. It's massmovement.healthcare@gmail.com. And yeah, we'll get you into our meetings. We'll get you plugged in with people, hopefully in your area. Obviously, some states we've got a lot more people, and others we might be starting from scratch. So I
Mhm.
do have a colleague who just recently moved to Seattle from North Dakota, and did introduce me to some folks. So we even have a little tiny start in North Dakota. But yeah,
There you go.
absolutely. Anyone out there who's hearing this and thinks it's exciting, get in touch and we'll build this together.
Awesome. And Roger Meadows, thank you for the super chat. Medicare for all and public banks as an amendment ballot initiative, not law in cheap states. Oklahoma, Arkansas, Arizona, Nebraska, Missouri, Montana, Colorado, North Dakota, and South Dakota. So the government can't repeal, weaken, or alter without asking voters first. Thank you so much for that, Roger. Yeah, I love the fact that you included the territories as well, because that's another thing that comes up sometimes is like, what about DC? People forget about DC a lot in reference to like passing policy. But I love the fact that you also included Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, America, Samoa, and Guam. Again, U.S. territories, they should also have the same benefit as well. But yeah, this is awesome, Andre. Like, I know you've been in this fight um for a couple of years, at least as long as I have known. And what I want to remind people is Andre is in Seattle, so he's in Shama Sawant territory. And he's in a city where, look, organizing on the ground is that's just how it is. Like, you have a lot of people there that this is what they do. Like, it's just a part of life for them. And we can have this in a lot of these other major cities as well. It's just about starting something and having people that want to be committed and people that actually want change.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that you would be like, yes, it is a part of sort of our culture, I would say, out here in Seattle, but it's also not a coincidence. I think it's something that's built over time, and uh, that's why I encourage people to think about that Venn diagram of their taxation, public banking, and small d democracy, because it is sort of like, you know, when you start to believe that you should be included in the process, then immediately you start to say, well, why shouldn't I be able to put something on the ballot, right? Are you saying that we as citizens, uh, you know, aren't as smart as our legislators, even though our legislators are supposed to be citizens representing us, right? So those contradictions start to be more obvious when you actually get involved. And so you start to say, well, I think I should get my ballot in the mail. I think I should be able to, you know, whatever it is, right? So so I think that just starting, and then it starts with just your sphere, right? Who can you get to go with you? But it gets bigger from there. And um, I think the number one thing actually that creates a sense of like civic culture is winning, right? So when you can get some wins, and then those wins make your life better and your community's life better, they go, wow, that was worth it. Maybe we'll do that again and win something else.
That's right. That's right. And I want to remind you guys, even this is not just something that is happening in blue states. Like even red states are passing some of these progressive policies. Nebraska just passed $15 minimum wage. South Dakota is also a red state. They expanded Medicaid. Like what I found anyway is that when you just give people the question and it's not attached to a political party or a candidate, that's what throws some people off once it's attached to a candidate. And like, I like what they're saying, but I don't like that person. So
Hmm.
then they're not voted for at all, right? So I think that this is giving people direct democracy, and that's the big difference than when we put forth politicians who most of the time they are lawyers, and we're trusting them to handle this type of situation. They're just one person. It's not just them in Congress. And even though they may vote one way, if you don't have the majority on board, these things are not getting through, or these bills aren't even brought to the floor, depending on who the speaker is, like you mentioned with Nancy Pelosi.
Right. Yeah. No. And, I think that, when I worked on the first Bernie campaign, and it really showed me the sort of media landscape that we live in, the way that, our partisan politics works and stuff. And it was like very eye opening and in some ways shocking to me. And I remember after that campaign saying to myself that I was going to keep organizing, but I was going to work locally instead of federally, and that I was going to work on an issue instead of a candidate. And the reality is, of course, I still work on all of these things. Um, but I think that you're totally right in that it might be something about human psychology, or, the way that we've been sort of culturally brought up to handle these things. But I think candidates and political parties become this shortcut, or like an excuse to turn your brain off, right? So the moment I heard that Bernie was a Democrat, I knew I would never vote for him, or whatever it is, right? But when you really make it issue, right, an issue and an issue only, right, it is both an invitation, but also kind of requires people to open their brain up and think about it, because they can't just say, I remember thinking that Bernie was right on basically every issue, and if it had just been about the issues, we would have all just been able to go home. But the problem was that the entire conversation became about whether or not he was like a good guy, which
Yep.
frankly I like him, right? But I don't care if he's a good guy. I care about who does he represent, what policies is he bringing to the table, right? And I just was so frustrated with the way that was pushed out of the conversation, that I try to organize in a way that would force the conversation to be about the issue and the issue only, because that's where we're on completely firm territory. And that's why
Mhm.
the way that they resist this is by trying to silence it and kill it quietly, right? We just passed this at Seattle City Council, right? It was a non-binding hybrid state federal resolution. Um, and it passed 4-2, but the two were abstentions, right? They don't want to vote it down because that would make them look really bad. They don't want for the rest of their lives to be hounded about that one time they voted no on giving everyone health care. So they
Yep.
abstain, right? So try to not give them the out. You know, take the no, but take it with the camera on, and then immediately say, "Okay, we hear your no. Do you mind explaining why?"
Yep. That's right. I want to address this from Betsy. Right, Sabby, but didn't Florida overturn the will of the people who passed a BI to give felons the right to vote? Yeah, that's true. I did talk about that, but that is a situation where the Democratic Party in Florida actually could have intervened there, and they did not. They had plenty of time to jump in and try to fix that, and they decided not to. We actually talked about this on Call In a couple weeks ago, how they decided to be reactive instead of proactive. That could have been prevented as well. But yeah, that is one of the cons sometimes, depending on which state you live in with ballot initiatives, is that the governor can come in and overturn it. But again, that's why there are certain provisions that you can put in to prevent that from happening as well. And they slept on that. Like, I'm sorry, but they did. Thank you for the super chat. Roger, Arizona for Medicare for All Coalition agreed to run Medicare for All ballot initiative amendment. That's awesome. I didn't know that, Roger. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, and we could definitely be in closer touch with the Arizona people. I think they're really small, and we haven't necessarily met them yet, but we'd love to hear about what they're doing and see how we can help.
Awesome. Well, Andre, thank you so much for coming on. Let me know if there's any updates, you know, and you want to come back on to talk more about that as well. But thank you so much. And like I said, you know, kudos to you for sticking in there, you know, and hanging in there and still fighting for healthcare for people.
Thank you so much, Sabby. And yeah, it's better to have hope and keep working than it is to just pack it all in. You know, that can be the easy way, but it's not better.
That's right. That's right. Thanks
All
so
right.
much, Andre.
Bye, everyone. Thank you, Sabby.
Bye.